Hi, I'm Kevin Capehart. The paper I'm presenting today is called Fine Water, a Blind Taste Test. And this is joint work that I did with Dr. Elena Berg when we did most of this work when we were working together at the American University of Paris, which is in Paris, France. And she is not here today, but I have a photo of her. So here's my co-author in the science teaching lab that we have at AUP. And in this lab, she teaches like environmental sciences and stuff like that. She's a real scientist. I'm just an economist. But this is also the lab in which we did a series of blind taste tests using different waters, 4 different brands of bottled water that I'll talk about in just a second, and also tap water. In this case, the tap water that was most easily obtained by us, which is just out of a faucet in this particular lab. Who did we use for, what were the subjects for our taste test? It was students, over 100 students that we recruited from our university. We gave them a brief training before doing this water tasting, and then we got it underway. I could talk about the students and the training and other things like that, but I want to hurry up so I can get to the results. But let me talk a little bit about our motivation. So this is a taste test that we did. There's obviously been a lot of blind taste tests of wine and also beer, and then we heard about a cannabis blind taste test the other day. So we wanted to try to use some of the same sort of methods that people have used to look at wine, but instead of looking at bottles of wine, we wanted to use bottles of water to do this sort of taste test. And why were we inspired to look at water in the way that we look at wine? Well, as we argue in the paper, it is sort of the case that water seems to be turning into wine in the sense that more and more water is sort of being treated with the same sort of sophistication or snobbery, however you want to see it, in terms of the same sort of sophistication that's treated with wine. So, for example, there's at least a few self-identified water sommeliers. This guy's probably the most famous one. He's been in the press a lot. He works at a restaurant in Los Angeles, California, and he curates, he's selected 20, if you go to the restaurant, there's 20 different brands of bottled water. About half of them are still, about half of them are sparkling. So he's picked out all these different waters using his expertise that he has. And since they have a whole bunch of waters, they also have a water menu, sort of like a wine list. There's at least a few restaurants in the world. This is probably the most extensive list there. It's 45 pages long to describe these 20 waters. You open it up to any given page, and it shows you a picture of the bottle, and it tells you its price. This one's about $11 per liter in US dollars. Tells you about some of the mineral content, sodium, magnesium, calcium. And it also gives a little description of the water, similar, and they use the same sort of flowery, maybe BS language that's used for wine. So, for example, for Acqua Panna, part of the description, it says, the first sip has a pleasant, fresh taste due to the low acid and low mineral salt content. Not without structure, it imparts a taste that is light as a feather, pleasantly soft and velvety. So if that's starting to make your mouth water or making you thirsty, you might buy this, again, for about $11 per liter. Another example of the way in which water is sort of being treated like wine is that there are guidebooks to bottled water. They're similar to guidebooks to wine. This is by another self-identified water sommelier. This one's called Fine Waters, a water connoisseur's guide to the world's most distinctive bottled waters. Again, open it up to any page. They have a picture of a nice-looking bottle, another flowery description, where is it from, different information about its mineral content and whatnot. A final example of the way in which water is being treated like wine is that there are water tastings. The one that's probably been going on for the longest is held in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. And you show up if you're a panelist. For one of the sessions at least, you get 20 glasses of water where people send in bottled waters and also municipal tap waters to be judged. And these judges, they taste them, they score them. And as part of the scoring, they use a 14-point scale to rank them. And on this scale, it's a 14-point scale, 14, the higher the better. If you taste the water and you say, this water tastes really good, I would be very happy to have it for my everyday drinking water, you give it a 14. If, on the other hand, you taste it and you say, this water has a terrible strong taste, I can't stand it in my mouth, then you give it a 1. And similar with different levels in between. For example, with a 7, you say, this water has a fairly bad taste, but I think I could accept it as my everyday drinking water. So this is one of the scales that they use. So again, what I'm saying here is that water is being treated a lot like wine. And of course, we live in a world in both developing countries and even our own developed countries like the United States of America here. Not everyone has easy access to safe drinking water. And there's also issues with the cost in terms of like negative externalities of the transportation and the packaging of bottled waters. So obviously bottled water is a controversial issue, but at least from sort of a consumer perspective, if we really like that bottled water, if we're really willing to pay that $11, and we'd even be willing to foot the bill for any sort of negative externalities that we're generating, then, at least from, if you believe in consumer sovereignty, then so be it. There's lots of benefits. I'm willing to bear the cost of them. But what we wanted to look at is, where you have all these different bottled waters, there's a million. I just went down to the corner store, and they have a pretty good selection there. There's a bunch of them, but if we take away the bottles, if we take away the descriptions, if we take away all that sort of stuff, and just have the water itself, can people actually tell a difference between different brands of bottled water? And if so, do they have any sort of preference over them? So that was our motivation for doing this blind taste test. And there's thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of bottled waters. And in some sense, there's a bunch more tap waters. Any faucet in the world might have its own terroir, so to speak. So we chose a small number of bottled waters. And we also used tap water, again, from the faucet in the place we did the study. Which four did we pick? Well, we're not water experts ourselves. So we went and we found, we picked ones that were in both that guidebook to bottled waters that I mentioned before, and they were also in that water menu at that LA restaurant. So, this is, again, the Fine Water Guide, world's most distinctive waters, and probably good ones. And similarly, if you're making a wine list or a water list at a restaurant, presumably you're picking ones that are good and varied rather than bad and all the same. So we picked out ones from these two sources. And we also tried to pick ones that varied in terms of what water experts call the TDS, the total dissolved solids. And according to them, this is the thing that is the most important to the taste of water. It's essentially a measure of sort of how many minerals are in there. And different waters definitely have different tastes. If you have a mineral water like this is like one of the most popular mineral waters in Germany. I think if you taste it, it has like 2,500 milligrams of sodium and minerals and all of that. It sort of tastes like, it has a taste to it, other ones don't. So we tried to pick ones that varied in taste. And I should also mention we used just still water. We didn't use any sparkling water because we wanted to make sure that they all look the same. It was, different sparkling waters do vary in their carbonation levels and things like that. So those are the ones that we used for our particular study. And we actually did a few different studies using the same groups of students coming in. And I'm going to talk about each of these in turn really quickly to get to the results. The first one was a sort of sensory discrimination test, the so-called triangle test, where you have three glasses here that look the same. In two of those glasses, we put the exact same brand of bottled water. And one of them we put a different one, the so-called singleton. If I could actually tell the difference between these two types of water, then I should be able to say, aha, it's this one that's different than the other two, where of course we're randomizing these sorts of things. But if I can't tell a difference, then by chance alone, I should have a 33% chance to just by accident pick the right one. And we actually did a series of these triangle tests. We did 4. This is the template that we use laid out where with each of the 4 sets of triangle tests, the student would go through and do it. What did we find in terms of, we compared the different bottled waters. What did we find? Well, we found that, the students were better than just random chance. All these numbers here are bigger than 33%. And in at least 3 out of the 4 cases, they are statistically significantly bigger than 33% at conventional levels. So, that is sort of interesting finding. People are better than chance at telling differences, at least between these waters that we tried to pick out to be quite distinct. But they're still not very good. None of them are better than 50%, so still half the time I'm getting it wrong. And that's also an interesting finding because we see similar findings with, for example, Goldstein looking at pale European lagers, which some people say taste like water. Similarly, the best result they found was about 50%. And also, we talk about it in more detail in our paper. But with similar triangle tests with wines, if you look, usually, sometimes they're no better than chance and things like that. And in terms of preferences, we had them talk about their preferences in terms of the that same 14-point scale where we also included tap water. And what do we find? Who was the winner? Well, we can do different rankings and things like that, but in general, there's no clear winner. 25% of people said that Fiji water was their favorite, but also 25% of people said it was the least favorite out of the 5. In terms of tap water, didn't do quite as well as I would have hoped, but still 20% of people said it was their most preferred. It was also the one that got the lowest. These are international students who didn't really grow up drinking the Parisian tap water, so maybe that is part of that finding there. But in general, what I'd emphasize is that it is very inconsistent rankings and fairly heterogeneous. Maybe this was reflecting different tastes, or maybe it's just reflecting not particularly strong. The last result I mentioned really quick. The last study is we took those flowery descriptions that were at the water menu at that LA restaurant, and we say, okay, here's a description from Aquapana. Can you match it to that one? And for tap water, again, I'm not a water expert, so I couldn't really write a description. So I just said, which one's tap water? Can you find it? And people were really terrible at this. For any given one, I have 5 descriptions, including the tap water. I should have at least a 20% chance of getting it right. There's one that's statistically significantly different than 20% at conventional levels, but it's not very big in terms of substantive or practical significance, and they're all pretty uniform. And notice that people weren't very good at saying, this one's the tap water. And also there's some results where people guessed the water they didn't like, they guessed that was tap water. So these are a number of findings, lots of interesting ones that are in the paper that you can check out as well, and all the data is available to analyze the different rankings and things like that as well. So I'll go ahead and conclude there, but thank you very much for having us, and thank you on behalf of my co-author.